2 more minutes. 2 minutes. Two more minutes. I just wanted you to turn it on. I just wanted you to turn it on. It's good. Great. A little over 1 minute remaining. A little over 1 minute remaining. What's that? I am. Yeah. No, I'm preaching Sunday at Belgrade. Yeah, so I'll be here. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good. I misquoted. It's not XOC, it's XOK. I don't know whether to correct that here or probably be too technical. If you're doing it, probably too technical. Well, I'm sure that's probably yeah. But I need to study it. I got XOC out. But it's FFK, and the only time it chooses positively is reference to the authority of God. Yeah. Okay, let's moan back. Let's moan back. Yeah, there we go. There we go. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Therefore I will hope. That's a Get 'em In song. You know what a Get 'em In song is? Yeah, I grew up in Mayfield, Kentucky. It's my hometown. My folks are still there. They were all right. They got through the tornado just fine. Town flattened, but they made it okay. I grew up Northside Church of Christ, and we used to have this song. The name was W.T. Wynn. Now, W.T. Wynn, I'm trying to think. Just trying to think of an old style hymn that just bellows out. What would one be? How great thou art. Okay, this guy was tall, had this huge operatic voice. How great thou art. Now, I grew up with this, okay. It's better than, who was the guy who used to sing for Billy Graham?
George Shea.
George Beverly Shea. Better than George Beverly Shea. I could literally see W.T. if there's, I'd rather have Jesus. Okay. Well, he used to sing these songs. Remember, tobacco was the bumper crop in Mayfield, Kentucky. Okay. You know, the bumper crop is the big crop everybody grew. And I grew up working tobacco. I never will forget one time, a young teen preacher. And I really, I had this thing about trying to convince everybody in my family that smoked that they shouldn't do so. And so I prepared this sermon on the sin of smoking. And so I walked into this little church one day, little Barlow church, and Brother Bradley, the guy who used to give me my check, and I got another story about Brother Bradley, but I won't tell you because you won't be able to forget it. Brother Bradley said, "What you going to preach on this morning, preacher?" And I said, "On the sin of smoking." So I did. He came up to me afterwards, handed me my check, and he said, "Now, I want you to know this check comes from proceeds of several tobacco farms." Brother Wynn, though, he'd stand up and sing that Get 'em In song. And the Get 'em In song was for the purpose of getting the men who were out in front of the building to put out their cigarettes and come into the building. And I saw so many of those guys opening the door, flipping their cigarette out on the little pad out there in front of the building, blowing smoke into the lobby as they would come in. So, anyway, that was a Get 'em In song. Not that you had to put out your cigarettes, but don't get me talking about the sin of smoking. All right. Whew. All right. Page 2. Let's keep going. I've got Well, I know how much time I have. Yeah, okay. All right, good. I got about 27 more minutes. Okay. All right. I hope I'm not wearing you out. I hope it's beneficial to you. I want it to be. Look at the second one up on page 2, elders unwilling to grow in their role. Now, I'm preaching to the choir here on that, right? I mean, you've come to the Shepherd Network, and so I know you're not of this tribe, but there is a strong tribe in Church of Christ elders who I'll just be honest, they don't grow in their role. Now, their preachers are the same way. I went Freed Hardman and got my 3-year certificate and learned all the Bible I needed to from Brother H.A. Dixon. I haven't had to study a day since. That's preachers. Okay, all right. And just because I heard a preacher say that as I was growing up, I studied under the best. And, okay. I know preachers can do it too, but elders can get that way sometimes, where they operate from year to year without an intentional plan to become more effective. And this includes failure to utilize resources, books, etc., or respond to minister efforts to keep them abreast of best practices. They just don't respond to it. Now, I think that's changing some. I think it is changing some. Fortunately, a lot of the literature on good theology, good textual study, and practical resources has a little broader use. I know elders who, I've suggested to elders, for example, that they listen to Tom Rainer's podcast, just on practical church wisdom. Listen to Tom and his son, just wax elephants on practical church wisdom. It's really good. And I know elders who listen to that. I know elders who listen to Theology in the Raw, Preston Sprinkle. And we could probably list other podcasts that people listen to, that a lot of elders listen to, where they're just trying to stay abreast of some of the developments and trying to be educated on these issues. So I know it's not, the problem is not as bad as it has been in the past, but it's still there. And ministers get frustrated with it because they're thinking, I'm growing all the time. And I'm really trying hard to grow in my understanding of things. And if I share a resource with the elders and then ask, hey, could we get together over in 2 or 3 weeks and talk about this resource that I've laid out to them, and then we meet, they're not even read it. They haven't even put any effort into it. And it's just discouraging because I know it would help us through this issue that we're dealing with. I know it would help us if we would just become familiar with this, or if we would just sit and listen to this one Q Ideas talk. I don't know if you're familiar with Q Ideas. Q Ideas, oh my, ministers particularly, become familiar with Q Ideas. It's put up by the Barna Group, Barna Research Group. Just look it up, Q Ideas Forum. You have to subscribe to it. Used to it was free, but now you have to subscribe. It's George Barna and the Barna Research Group bringing together TED Talk, TED-like talks. TED Talks, these short, 15, 20-minute speeches, or less than that, actually 10, 15-minute speeches on a variety of things on technology, design, and that kind of thing. It's really pretty fascinating. For somebody who's like me who's not a scientist, I'm able to keep up with some of the good scientific minds by listening to TED Talks. Well, Q Ideas Forum is kind of like TED Talks for church leaders. And what Barna does is they bring some of the best conservative evangelical scholarship to bear on the tough cultural issues. Get a church subscription. I'm really serious, or at least get a leadership subscription to where, 15 or so of you would be able to do it. I think that's, you're going to pay, I don't know exactly what it is, $99 a month or something to do it. But all you'll have to do, guys, you'll get the benefit of just by listening to 4 or 5 key ones. Because they're really, really good. And, and I suggested that to a group here not long ago, and they subscribed, and they were so good that they started actually getting together. They actually got together on a Friday night one time at their house and had dinner and listened to Q Talks, because it was so beneficial to them. So I strongly, strongly encourage it. But whatever it might be, if you've looked there in the suggestions, I've said, in association with the items mentioned above, elders initiate their own growth, even setting aside time in the cycle of meetings to include books and podcasts and other materials that may help them improve. Now, guys, I know it's hard. Don't misunderstand me. I know you have to build it in intentionally, and you have to keep it tenaciously. Because I never will forget once. When I was preaching, I'll have to admit, I didn't understand the incredibly difficult schedule that a lot of my elders kept. I was, to be honest, I didn't understand it. When I would call an elder and say, hey, can we have lunch in the next couple of weeks? And he would say to me, Carlus, I'm sorry, but I really don't have anything available till like a month from now. I kind of got the feeling he was evading me, or he didn't. No, I understand now. Marginal time is really hard to find for a lot of our elders, and it was really brought home to me one time when I had an elder, who didn't show up at a meeting, and he didn't show up on time, and when he did show up, he came to the meeting, and bless his heart, he fell asleep in the meeting. And I talked with him afterward, and I said, what's going on, brother? He said, Carlus, he said, he's a partner at his law firm. He said, literally, I've worked 100 hours this week. I don't have any breathing space. I have no margin on my schedule. I want to be a faithful elder, and I love this church, but I'm just getting to where I don't have time. Well, I understand. I know the time demands are huge, which means you really have to set aside time to do this. Okay, but I think it can be very, very important for the elders and ministers to do it together. You say, well, I don't know of any resources. Talk to your minister. My guess is your minister, if he doesn't know a resource, all he will have to do is get on the phone. That's all he'll have to do. He'll just get on the phone and talk to 2 or 3 of his buddies, and he'll have a whole list of things. The difficulty will not be deciding having something to read. It would be deciding what to read, what to listen to, because there's so much material out there. There really, truly is. In fact, we have more information than we know what to do with now. The issue is not so much, is the information out there? It's siphoning through the information and emphasizing it. By the way, Carrie Nieuwhoff's new book on burnout in ministry on that is superb. It's really, really good. Yeah, read through that. And I say the book's really, really good. I want to be careful to let you know I've only listened to several podcasts on it. I've not actually read the book. But everything he has said about the book and all the suggestions he's made out of that book, I've just really, really liked. I've actually heard him featured by 2 different podcasters, Carrie Nieuwhoff. His name is spelled really weird-like. It's almost as weird as Gupton. So I don't know if I can pronounce it, spell it right, but Carrie Nieuwhoff, his new book on ministry burnout. I don't even know what the title is, but it's good. And he talks about how to build margin and good schedule. And yes, I'm operating with some ADD here, so let me get back in focused. Grow in your role, okay? Then the last one on page 2. Imbalanced representation of the biblical range of missional impulses on the leadership team. Now, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Okay, there's an imbalanced representation of missional impulses. Now, I'm going to rattle the Church of Christ cage here a little bit, okay? So I want you to get ready for it. You're going to want to take the bars, and you're going to want to, I don't know about this, okay? So let me just stretch you for a little while here, and I'm the guy with the briefcase from out of town. I bet your preacher doesn't even believe this, okay? So don't test him on it, okay? I get to say things and leave, right? Church leadership can often fail to maintain the 5-fold missional impulses of apostle, prophet, evangelist, and shepherd teacher. Now, I call them missional impulses, not offices. Please don't go out of here saying, Gupton's into that apostle thing now. He's wanting churches to appoint apostles. No, I didn't say that. Okay, not even coming close to saying that. I'm calling them missional impulses. But read Ephesians 4, and Ephesians 4 seems to think that all 5 of these impulses are important to the maturing of the church. Just read that. Paul says it. Paul says, you can say, well, some of that was in the past, and we have what we have now. Well, maybe, but listen to me on this. By the way, there's a whole batch of literature out on this. Just tons of stuff out there. Briggs and Hyatt's book, Eldership and the Mission of God, discusses this very thing, and it's really, I think it's Briggs and Hyatt. I may be getting the wrong one, getting it goofed up with another one, but there's some good elder material on this very thing. We tend to migrate towards shepherd teachers who bear the entire burden. This develops churches that value caring and instruction over apostolic expansion, missionary efforts, prophetic clarity, saying difficult things to our churches, and evangelistic fruit. And then you see what that says? The apostolic impulse is sending. It's the mission expansion. And the prophetic clarity is there are times when words need to be spoken to very specific situations, where the Word of God needs to be brought to bear on a very specific developing situation. And most of the time when prophetic speech is mentioned, it's for the encouragement and edification of the church, yes. But there are often times when the prophetic speech that is being spoken of is the kind of prophetic speech to where people spoke truth to power. Okay, so there are lots of different ways of understanding the prophetic role. And evangelistic fruit. Let me applaud you on something here. You don't have the luxury in the Northwest to grow by attraction. And, well, to some extent you can, I get that. But you don't have the luxury to grow by transfer. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. I don't know of a church that's really growing by evangelistic fruit. I don't know that I could point to one that's just doing an outstanding job of that. Probably is somewhere, I just don't know about it. But there's a ton of them growing by expansion. Why? Because, well, everybody's moving from this place to Nolensville, or they're moving from here to Hendersonville, or they're moving to Brentwood, or they're moving out of the expensive places where you have to spend $1 million for 10 square feet and, going to Murfreesboro or something like that. And they grow by transfer, by the movement of the population. Here it's a little bit different, and I hear you guys talk a lot more about evangelism than I do when I go to other places in the country. But I think you understand, perhaps more than most, how important it is to keep all of those missional impulses going. Now here's the thing. I believe those missional impulses represent completely different sets of gifts. I do. I mean, somebody who's a really good shepherd teacher, or somebody who's a really great shepherd, is probably not going to be the same person who's able to speak with prophetic clarity. In fact, they may back off from speaking with prophetic clarity because they have a very, very hard time saying difficult things to people they love. It's hard to move them in that direction. Hard even to get them to the point that they're willing to let someone else do it. Okay? And that's part of the reason why I think we have an issue that is present among us that Ed Friedman would describe as an emphasis on empathy over principle-centered direction. Read some stuff from Ed Friedman. He's my favorite Jewish agnostic rabbi. Wrote a book several years ago called Generation and Generation, Family Processes in Church and Synagogue, applies family systems theory to church life. And yeah, I mean, theologically, I'm sure I know he and I are just like worlds apart. But in terms of the way churches function and the way religious groups function, he's on to something where he says in times of high anxiety in our churches, we begin to be driven more by empathy and our feelings than we do by doing what is right and needed and principle-centered. We have difficulty with that. Well, who is it that's sitting at the table with the missional impulses who's going to be thinking, guys, we need to speak clearly on this? It's going to be somebody with a prophetic missional impulse. Are you with me there? I mean, that's the kind of thing I'm getting at here. Or somebody who says, guys, it's time for us to start a church over there where that entirely new development is planned in the next 15 years. It's time for us to start thinking now about getting a piece of land, putting a church over there. Let's get several churches together. Let's try to pool our resources. Let's find somebody to start building a mission team so that they can move in here in the next 5 years. Who thinks that? It's the people with the apostolic missional impulse. Are you following me there? That's the point I'm making. And sometimes within our leadership teams, we're imbalanced there. We don't have an adequate representation, which means that we have churches that are weighted more on the teaching and shepherding end of things. And when that happens, you have churches that are incredibly well biblically educated and cared for, which is wonderful. I mean, we want to be biblically educated and cared for, don't we? And to be mutually caring for each other, but there's more to that. That's a kind of religious, it's almost a religious club orientation, right? We can become extremely ingrown there. So what do I suggest? Well, within the governance structure of elders, ministers, and deacons, which I believe is taught in Scripture, uphold the fivefold functions as missional impulses that are necessary for the maturing of the church. Seek ways to build more well-rounded leadership teams. Educate our churches to respect the importance of the fivefold function. Apostolic sending and expansion, prophetic clarity, correction and challenge, evangelistic fervor, love for the unreached, shepherdly, compassionate care, teaching that richly and deeply equips. And I've got a note there, and if you look at the bottom and the end notes, you'll see some resources that I have suggested there. There's some really fine resources. I also wrote part of my chapter in the most recent Hope Network book discusses this, and I critique it. I mean, I offer some critique in there as well, because I realize that we have to be careful about how we appropriate this, right? All right, now, next. Decisions made in isolation from the ministers. This expresses itself in two ways. One's without consistent presence of the ministers. Most decisions are made without their input. And then ministers are informed with the congregation. Now, you talk about something that will make a minister really uncomfortable. Because here's what's going to happen after that decision. Somebody's going to come up to the minister and say, will you help me understand that? And the minister's going to have to say, you know about as much about it as I do. You know, that can be a really uncomfortable spot. Or the elders may allow the ministers to be part of the discussion, but dismiss them during the deliberation. What are some potential strategies? Meet together as the default pattern, with a healthy rhythm of separate meetings. Arrive at shared understanding of how decisions be made, majority, consensus, process for dissent, so on. And give ministers a strong voice based on expertise, position, and the fact that they hear from people that elders do not hear from. Elders hear from people the ministers never hear from. Ministers hear from people that the elders never hear from. Elders hear things from people that those same people talk to the ministers and say something completely different. And vice versa. Now, I know you guys know that. And if you don't know it, I mean, this is Church 101, okay? It really is true that somebody lobbies you. It's out there. They narthex you. They vestibule you, okay? They corner you, and they say something, and then they go to Chipotle with the minister, and they say something completely different. Same person, completely different. Out of the same mouth comes salt water and fresh. Well, yeah, it's James 3, right? Oh, that's a little out of context, but it sounded good. Okay, but I admitted it was out of context, okay, so at least I got that out of the way. Give ministers a strong voice. Next, decisions based on keeping constituents happy rather than on missional objectives. Decisions are politically based, depending on either representative constituencies of the elders or the groups or individuals who do not like a potential direction. And this can go both ways, both as a push for or against change. You guys have experienced this. But the ones that most often see this happening, honestly, are the ministers. And here's part of the reason why. The elders sometimes are more enmeshed into the relational system of the congregation than are the ministers. And because they tend to be a little more enmeshed into the relational system of their church, they have difficulty understanding how much their decisions are bent upon pleasing those that are part of their reference group. And it's a blind spot. I'm not saying it's a purposeful thing. It's not as if elders set out to be people pleasers. That's not the point. It's a blind spot. They can't see it. Well, the ministers have less of that enmeshment. And some of it's because of the length of time they've been there. Some of it's because of their role. People don't relationship with the minister and the family in the way they do with the elders. It's just, there's a little more distance. There just is. That's why ministers usually have only 3 or 4 people in the church that they're really close to. And don't be moaned at, by the way. Let them have their friends. But there are very few people who have the maturity to be really good friends with the ministers without using that friendship in a way that becomes politically difficult to manage, right? And so for that reason, ministers don't have the same degree of enmeshment. And they're able to see sometimes that the decisions that have been made are people-pleasing decisions. And it's the same group, seemingly, over and over, who have more influence in what's going on. And it frustrates them because they're thinking, I'm thinking of this really great thing we need to do, but you're not willing to do it because of Sister Susie or Brother Jim or whatever. And, you know, they may be big givers, and ministers sitting there saying, I wish I had enough money to buy them out, you know. You know, they're frustrated with that. Okay. Well, what do? Shift away from representative-based to principle-based leadership. Now, that's a really hard shift to make, right? I know that's true. It's easy to express. It is very, very hard to do when the people you've known and gone to Sunday school with for the past 30 years and you went to high school with and graduated with them are the ones who appointed you as their elders. And they usually do so without realizing that they're doing it, but there's sort of this unwritten expectation that you'll represent me well at the table. Get away from that representative leadership. Get to a principle base. Train your church to expect that from you. Now, that's a little harder to do in America. I get it, because we have a representative republic, right? And so we're accustomed, if we elect a senator, that representative is supposed to represent the will of the people in that district or that region. Well, we sometimes appoint leaders in our volunteer-based groups, including churches, with that same orientation. And it's not good to lead churches that way. Churches need to be led on the basis of missional impulses, not on the basis of making people happy and striking. It's an illusion, by the way. You know that. I mean, even if you try to make people happy, you know it's an illusion, right? And that's not to say that making people happy is a bad thing. I mean, there are pathologies we associate with those who just don't care about people's happiness. You know, so certainly we need to be concerned about that, but it cannot be the primary impulse. Now, next. Decisions gravitating toward a dominant or toxic elder. Whew. Man, this takes a long time. The group tends to defer to 1 or 2 elders who have the strongest influence. This can also devolve into the elders tolerating a toxic or rogue elder who is controlling and demeaning and who may disregard healthy boundaries, that is, manipulates the members into discreet elder proceedings. Wow. There's a great book by Kenneth Hauk, Haugk, Antagonist in the Church. It's really good to read on this. You got to be careful reading it, honestly, because you know sometimes you can read books like that and it gets you into psychobabble and labeling and that sort of thing and diagnosing, and we need to be careful there. But it is true, there's some folks who are quite toxic in the church, and a lot of times they're appointed to leadership because they're very charismatic. They often have, they're what Pete Steinke calls the people of the charm. You know, they have a bit of a narcissistic pattern, and narcissists can gain a foothold in highly volunteer-based small communities. I mean, they really can, and it can be dangerous. Well, how do you deal with that? There's no way around mutual accountability on the next spot. There's no way around it. Mutual accountability, healthy interpersonal interaction, and external self-awareness, elders holding toxic persons to high accountability, guarding the rest of the team from their influence, and an established cyclical practice of training and appointing new elders to balance the mix of personalities. Let me see. I'm going to have to prioritize here. let me ask you to pay very, very careful attention to page 4. I'm not going to have time to cover it, but it has to do with primarily minister role ambiguity and how to address it. Let me just say something real quickly about that before I go back to the previous page. I had a friend at Johnson University who did a PhD in organizational psychology from University of Tennessee, one of the most competitive programs in org psychology in the nation. And he went through and finished the program, aced it. He did a really fine job. He wrote his dissertation on ministerial role ambiguity in the Churches of Christ and the Christian churches. It's awful. I mean, it really is tough. I've written this entire page on page 4. The entire page of page 4, actually all the way through page 5, the top of page 5, is written to address this whole notion of role ambiguity. And in order for me to get into it, it's really another 45 minutes for me to cover that next section. So I'm not going to do it. But if you're going to read any part as a group and sort of get apart and read any part as a group to reflect back on some of the things we've talked about, I encourage you to go to that section because it's a huge, huge issue among us. Now, let me address this last one there on the bottom of page 3. And if you'll give me the liberty to probably go over maybe 3 or 4 minutes, I'm sorry. I know you gave me a long time, but this next one, guys, is it's a whole day. It's a whole day to address this. The unwillingness to discuss difficult topics that influence missional effectiveness without polarizing or labeling. Let me just go ahead and list a few of them. LGBT. LGBT. You can't not discuss that in today's church. And here's what I'm encountering. When I mention that to elders, they back off because it's so polarizing. And here's what happens. In the absence of a clear voice of Scripture on that issue, what message wins out? Culture. Culture's message wins out. The vast majority of our young people do not know what the Scriptures say on that issue. And it's not their fault. They've heard us say it's wrong, but they haven't really heard a good biblical explanation relative to that. And in a time when the judgment basis for these issues is one's feelings and one's perspective, if it's your perspective and you own it and you're authentic with it, that's the authority on issues like that in our culture today. If you offer any kind of objective sense of what the Scriptures say on the issue, in a significant number of our churches, you're labeled as a homophobe. And it is a challenge. It's a huge challenge. This has to be addressed within our churches. It has to be. Here's another one. I know these two are not closely related, but in our church doings, they are closely related in that they're most often engaged at the same time. Some church decides they're going to address these big issues, and so they decide to address LGBT, racism, and the role of women. And maybe the instrument. Oh, we look at this and say, well, we don't have to address those in our church. All we got to do is just put out a policy. Try that. Without your church studying. Okay? The dynamics of fear relative to congregational response, anxious conflict avoidance, and doctrinal dissonance keep the leaders from discussing challenging topics of church faith and practice. But here's what's happening, guys. When we don't address the issues, they become a kind of theological cancer and a moral cancer. that just eat away at the moral and theological fiber of the church. There's no such thing as a sitting still neutrality on that. Read John Paul Comer in his book, Live No Lies. It's not a book on theology, a book on spiritual formation. Read what he says about Satan's deceptiveness and how it's at work within our culture. You know, I've gone a little from preaching to meddling. I know that, but oh my. So how do we do it? Learn the discipline of civil incarnational dialogue, leading to and surrounding faith statements on essentials and teaching letters on complex issues. Both elders and ministers shift away from pushing agenda, seek mutual understanding, and allow time for leader processing. You can begin your investigations on those issues, and it's still a year from now. You'll still be studying it to try to make some decisions on it. And then finally, balance the concerns of unity and missional progress without allowing the complexities associated with either to minimize the other. Yeah. And please do hear me out. On that last one, if Scripture doesn't address it, culture doesn't stop addressing it. And that message becomes the dominant one. Okay. All right. Guys, I wanted to spend even longer than I did on these, and you gave me an hour and 45 minutes, and I went 5 minutes over. And I thank you for your attention and for your concern about your church enough that you're here. I mean, I applaud you for being here. The Montana group, the Idaho, Wyoming, Canada, you folks from up here. Minnesota, Oregon, where everybody talks funny compared to us Southerners. I really do love you guys. I've really come. This group of people, these church leaders up in this region of the country have a very special place in my heart. And I mean it when I say I'm really honored that you haven't grown tired of me. And you still let me come and wax elephants with you from time to time. So thank you for letting me be here. I hope this has been beneficial. Blessings.
Thank you very much, Carlus. And you have some reading material to do as you head in here. So Carlus will be preaching actually in Belgrade on Sunday morning, but he'll be here throughout. So if take him out to lunch, take him out to breakfast. If you want to visit about more of this, one of the whole things about this is allowing you to have